Hello, good morning. I'm Matt Addison. Today I've got James Martin alongside me. We're going to be talking through the latest Liverpool-related transfer rumours and Reds-related gossip ahead of tonight's game with Crystal Palace. Matheus Nunes has been linked with Liverpool and lots of other Premier League clubs, of course, over the last few weeks. Manchester City are now said to be the keenest on him. Well, Marcelo Brozovic as well, a familiar name in the gossip columns for a number of years now, if we're all being honest, is back on the agenda as well. We'll have a little bit of a chat around him. But James, let's start with Matheus Nunes. He's someone we've spoken about a few times over the last few weeks on this show for good reason. He's been linked fairly heavily, at least in Portugal, with Liverpool. We don't think that they're going to be signing another midfielder. It doesn't look particularly likely. But is Manchester City's need in midfield bigger than Liverpool's, do you think?
Well, not especially. So I suppose Liverpool will probably be kind of sneakily liking this link because if anything did come of it and they did sign Nunes, there really isn't very much space left at all in that midfield. I suppose it would be looking sort of longer term. I think Gundogan's into the last year of his deal. So I suppose it's a similar situation to Liverpool in that sense, where you've got Keita in the last year of his deal. And then in terms of the age bracket, you've got Henderson, Thiago, both in that similar category to Gundogan. So, yeah, Man City would probably be acting early and going for Nunes to fill that sort of void if they went for him now. But in terms of, the here and now, you wouldn't say they have a glaring need for a midfielder either. They signed Calvin Phillips this summer, of course, which reinforced the ranks. They did lose Fernandinho, but ultimately he was 36, 37 at that sort of time. He was essentially in that kind of James Milner role, and you wouldn't think Liverpool would necessarily sign a direct replacement for him when he moves on. So, yeah, it's a tricky one. You can't necessarily see that Nunes is an obvious need for either team, but yeah, maybe in terms of long term planning, he could come onto the radars of both.
Yeah, I mean, he's a good player, isn't he? Pep Guardiola did say, Pep Guardiola is known for these kind of big comments, but he did say he was one of the best players in the world, which is fairly big praise after they played Sporting last season. But I suppose the only thing that could change it, you say they don't really need a midfielder at the moment, but Bernardo Silva continues to be linked with a move away. Barcelona would be the obvious destination if they can somehow find another £80 million to add to their transfer pot. But I don't know. Maybe that could be the option. Maybe if one of the players did leave, I mean, even then though, it would seem a little bit of a downgrade to me. I think Bernardo Silva would be a massive loss for them, to be honest.
Yeah, it wouldn't necessarily seem entirely like for like either. You have that kind of midfielder come attacker in Bernardo Silva who can sort of slot in the midfield three or in that front line. I mean, latterly he has been much more deployed centrally, but he does have that kind of profile about him. Liverpool have plenty of them in the squad at the moment coming through with the likes of Harvey Elliott, Fabio Carvalho, Curtis Jones. They all have that sort of profile. Obviously, not quite at the same level as Bernardo yet, but it's a very specific sort of breed of player. And I don't know, maybe I haven't seen enough of Nunes, but I wouldn't necessarily associate him with that kind of versatility. So yeah, I do think Bernardo could unstop a lot of things and get some balls rolling for teams that thought they might have been done in the transfer window. But whether that leads to Nunes, I'm not sure that's where the dominoes would fall.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And just lastly, then, before we move on from Matheus Nunes, I mean, he's been linked with a lot of teams, as we mentioned before. He's apparently rejected West Ham and Wolves and wants a bigger move. I suppose the kind of overriding feeling for me at this moment is that these links, firstly with Liverpool, until that was kind of ruled out, now Manchester City, it does kind of feel a bit like his agent might be trying to find him a better move, a Champions League move. And if he doesn't get that, he might just wait until next summer and see if there's one then.
Yeah, it seems very plausible, doesn't it? Like we touched upon, I mean, Liverpool, you could say they're an obvious destination with the injuries, but equally, Klopp's made it clear that he's not going to panic buy. He's not going to sign a long-term solution for what is really a short-term problem. And Man City, as we've said, have pretty decent depth in the midfield already. So, yeah, it does seem like links that have been plucked out of very little for someone who's maybe keen on a big move. And yeah, he's a young player still, very young. There's no rush on it. And if it does transpire that he stays at Sporting for another season, then maybe there'll be more substance in the links come next year. But yeah, it's fair enough if he has his sights set on a Champions League club. But whether he gets that this summer, it's looking probably more and more doubtful.
Yeah, I think as we've said a few times this summer, I think if anyone was going to go for him, certainly if Liverpool were going to go for him, they certainly would have done already. It's not like the price tag has suddenly dropped or anything. There's been a release clause there. There's been all sorts of talk all summer, but I'm sure that will continue nonetheless. Let's move on to another player, though. Marcelo Brozovic is another name that, as I mentioned before, we've spoken about a few times. To me, just doesn't seem like an obvious fit for Liverpool at all. The sort of age, the way he would fit into this Liverpool team, the fact he's never played in England before, it would seem a lot more of a gamble even than Matheus Nunes. So again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, almost stylistically as much as anything else. I'm not quite sure I can see this one, but he is one that's been linked with Liverpool for a number of years now.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention the big new contract that he signed literally earlier this year. That would complicate any deal, I think, in terms of how much Liverpool would have to pay. I think if there was, the scope for a relative bargain deal, he could come onto the radar as someone the club might have considered. I mean, you look at Thiago, obviously very different situation in the sense that he is, a fully established world-class game changer. Obviously, Brozovic has been around for a number of years. He's a very impressive midfield presence, but maybe less of a kind of, okay, we'll break all of our transfer rules for you kind of player. But yeah, there is a gap in the squad in terms of backup number 6. It's basically the only obvious gap in the squad. So Brozovic does have that going for him in the sense that if we were to sign him, he would be a solution beyond just the injury crisis, while also helping to relieve that a little bit. So yeah, it maybe does make more sense than Nunes in that respect, but like you say, with the age profile, I think he's 29. It's not an obvious Liverpool signing. Like you say, no experience in the top flight in England, so how he would adapt, it's questionable. Even Fabinho took months before he was really thrown into the action, so it's a complicated position to play in this Liverpool team. So maybe by the time he was up to speed, you'd be asking yourself how many years does he have left at the top level. So yeah, unless there was a bargain to be had, I don't think it's one Liverpool would really touch with a barge pole.
Yeah, no, it doesn't feel like the perfect player, does it? That's what Liverpool have said all summer. If someone came up that they really felt was perfect, then he definitely would be bought, but it doesn't seem like that's going to be the case. So in terms of the sort of wider midfield then, obviously looking ahead a little bit to tonight's game as well, I suppose that the way I'm looking at it is firstly Liverpool have to win against Crystal Palace, but it would also be quite nice to see a couple of big performances in midfield. I suppose a lot of the rumours that we've seen this week would probably be a little bit knee-jerk off the back of last week. Henderson, Fabinho didn't play particularly well. Obviously, Thiago got the injury as well. A good performance from whichever three it is that start tonight probably would certainly help ease a few of those fears over the next few weeks.
Definitely. It's a real dilemma in midfield for Klopp, which hasn't necessarily always been the case. There's been, I mean, until quite recently, you'd have said Fabinho, Henderson, Thiago was a pretty nailed-on three for most of the big games. Obviously, Thiago's injury, but Fabinho, Henderson still very much available, even if they had a fairly unpleasant opening day. But yeah, I mean, just to give a sneak preview of the team selector pitch we've got coming out later, I think all three of us have named different midfields, which is quite unusual. So there's definitely options there. It's a tricky one in terms of who Klopp goes for. I mean, I'm inclined to think maybe he keeps his faith in Fabinho and Henderson. They have a lot of credit in the bank. They had one bad game. I mean, Fabinho, maybe you'd be a little concerned he's having a few more of those bad games over the last few months, but whether that's enough to see him hooked for this one, it remains to be seen. Henderson, again, it's tricky because he looked a lot better when we moved him deep into the 6 against Fulham, but if Fabinho's there, then he'd have to start at 8. There's a debate to be had about that in the long term. He's not looked at his best there again for, you'd say, a number of months, really. And then you've got Keita, who I think is probably the most obvious like-for-like replacement for Thiago. You can't really replace Thiago like-for-like, but in terms of that kind of profile of a pressing midfielder, a line-breaking midfielder, progresses the ball while also having those defensive responsibilities, I think that makes the most sense there. But then you're looking at the youngsters, Harvey Elliott in particular, but also Fabio Carvalho. They've certainly made strong cases in pre-season and even in the opening day when they came on and had an impact. So, yeah, I mean, despite the sort of midfield crisis, if you like, there's still plenty of interesting options there.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to see who comes in off the bench or who starts tonight. I think Harvey Elliott for me would be an absolute certainty, and then it's 2 more on top of that. But as well as that, I'm sure there'll be plenty more players still to be linked with Liverpool. We'll keep talking about those on these morning streams. Do join us again Monday to Friday. We'll continue to bring you all of the gossip, but I think that'll just about do us for now. James, thanks for joining me this morning. We'll have, of course, all the usual coverage around the Crystal Palace match later on today as well. So do check back in on Facebook, on liverpool.com, and on the Blood Red YouTube channel as well. As I say, though, that'll just about do us for now. We'll catch you very soon.